Hi everyone, this is the lecture on the for loops and iterable objects. We will just be touching on iterable objects today. This is mostly on for loops. So what is a for loop? A for loop is another type of loop. You've got your while loop and your for loop. So we covered while loops, and as you remember, those are loops that iterate until a certain condition is met. For loops iterate a certain number of times. Now everything you can do with a for loop, you can also do with the while loop. So while loops are the main loop and for loops are a helpful shortcut when you want to iterate a certain number of times. So here's the syntax for loop: for variable in iterable object, and then you execute the block of code however many times. For example, here for num in range 10, print num. And then range is just a function that generates an iterable that is a sequence of numbers between the start and the end. And we'll get into that over here with a little bit of code. So if we write for I in range of, let's say the example there was 0 to 10, we'll just print I. So when we run this, we expect 10 to be printed out. And get rid of those. Here we go. Prints out 10 times. Important thing to note is that that end number is exclusive. So 0 to 10 is going to run 10 times, but the highest number will be 9. Starts with 0, goes to 9. And that's 10 elements. Now, if we wanted to write the equivalent while loop, we would have our count is equal to 0. Oops. There we go. And then while count is less than 10, print count. And then we also have to remember to update the value. So count equals count plus 1, which is equivalent to count plus equals 1. Remember that you can combine any math operator with the equal sign to update the value of like count plus 1 or count times 1, etc. So here we have it printing the first 10 times from the for loop. Make that a little more clear. For loop and I, and then here we'll print y. Here we go. So the for loop is printing 0 through 9, and the while loop is printing the exact same thing. Now, to get a bit more into the range function, when you're in Spider, you can go to like put your cursor on something and then like a function, you're not sure what it does, and hit Command I. At least on Mac, it's probably Control I on Windows. And it'll bring up some documentation about it. So range, here's the documentation. Looks like we have another variable, an optional variable step. Variables in brackets are optional. So maybe we could say, if we wanted to count by 2, for example, and get all the odd numbers, we'll comment this out. Say for I in range, let's get all the odd numbers between 5 and 15, counting by 2 to get just the odds. This should start at 5 and then end at 13, not 15, because the last index is exclusive. There we go, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. If we wanted to get up to 15, we could just change that to a 16, and there we go. Now that same thing as a while loop would be count is equal to 0. Well, count is less than 16. Count should actually be equal to 5, not 0. If you want to make it equivalent. And then here we have to remember that we're incrementing by 2 instead of by 1. That's the step right there. And there we have it, the exact same thing. So you all can already do everything with just the while loop, but knowing that there's a for loop can make a code a lot simpler and cleaner, because this right here, it's very clear that it's trying to increment, or it's trying to run for a certain number of times between 5 and 16. Whereas this is going to take a bit longer to look at and understand and think through what is this code actually doing. Not to mention, it's also pretty easy to forget to increment this, and then you end up with an infinite loop. So this will just run, keep running forever until you kill the process. So when you're iterating, you want a for loop, and when you're going until a certain condition's met, then you really want to use the while loop. So going back to the presentation here, covered all of this. We covered this. This is just a for loop. And then here is the same thing as a while loop. This is a different way of printing out the even numbers. So this is a continue operator. When you're looping, this is for any type of loop, while or for loop. If you hit a continue, it'll skip to the next section of, or like skip to the next iteration of the loop. So we can see that over here. If we go in our for loop, let's make this a little bit simpler. So it's 0 to 10. And a shorthand for this is to write just 10. And it assumes you want to start at 0. If we want to skip, let's say 5 for some reason. So we'll write if I is equal to 5, continue. Otherwise, we want to print I. And so now we expect this to print out 0 through 4, and then skip 5, and then print out 6 through 9. As we can see, we've got 0 through 4, and then 6 through 9. And the continue operator can make reading your code more difficult. So whenever possible, I recommend you don't use it. Same thing with break right here. Break is another operator. It's like continue in that it modifies the loop in a different way. It breaks out of the loop. So this is saying when I gets to 5, break out and just stop looping. So here, think for a second what we'd expect when we actually run this. We would expect it to go 0 through 4 and then break out of the loop and not print anything else. And there we have it, first 5. This can also make your code confusing. So if you can think of a different way to write your code without using break, then that's generally the preferred way. For example, this, we could just use index of 2 for our start range. If we want to print out the even numbers between 2 and 10, we could start at 2 and then go to 11 with a step of 2. So here we go, quick question. So in which of these cases would you use a while loop and which would use a for loop? So the first one, you're writing a function that it's factorial of n, and it computes n factorial. It takes in an integer. What should you use here? Just think about it for a second. Now, if you remember calculating factorials, it's like n times n minus 1 times n minus 2, etc., until you get down to 0. In this case, since you have a set number of iterations, you're iterating, let's say, 5 times for if n equals 5, then you have that set number, so a for loop would be cleaner. Oops. So for the second one, get positive int that gets a positive whole number from the user. So the user's typing in all kinds of crazy stuff, -17, 2.5, all kinds of numbers, and your function is supposed to stop or like keep prompting as long as the user is entering bad numbers, and then stop as soon as the user enters a good number. What do you think you should use here? Right, so in this case, you've got you're looping until a condition's met. We don't know how many times it's going to take the user to finally input a positive whole number. It might be first try, it might be on the 50th try, it might be on the 200th try. So in that case, we're looping until a condition is met, and that would be a good use for a while loop. All right, we'll stop here for today, and I will add another screen share that talks about different types of iterables, and that's like a whole other topic.